So thank you for coming. This is a story from Australia that disappeared. Something happened. I'm glad we got you here. I'll move the computer across. It's not up there. Yeah. Which, interesting enough, though of course speaks across the seas, speaks to many issues for Indigenous peoples worldwide. And our journey is very much assisting communities where there's no longer much language being spoken, in some communities where there is no language being spoken, and in communities where they're trying to work with language records that are over 100 years old but are the only record of the language that was ever kept. So it's a journey, if we put it in a more theoretical perspective, of decolonizing. It's trying to unwrap colonization. And to unwrap colonization, well, Indigenous people know all about what colonization did. But the part of it is then how do you decolonize that space? And for people who are non-Indigenous, it's also entering into that space to decolonize themselves as well. So we are the Monash Country Lines Archive team, Brent McKee and Shannon Faulkhead, and we will all present here. So I want to start with this map. It's very difficult to read, but basically all those colours represent Australia 226 years ago when the British first arrived. There were 275 different languages, which means 275 different nations, and over 600 dialects of those languages. It was a site of great complexity, just like North America was a site of great complexity. However, of those 274 languages, only 20 of those languages and those 600 dialects remain strong today. And by strong, I mean all generations are still speaking them. Only 12% of all Indigenous people in Australia speak any other language than English at home. And there have been some other languages created because of colonisation, and these are Creole, which is a mixture of Indigenous language plus English, and another one in the Torres Strait, which is the pointy part of Australia between Australia and PNG. And there's a Pidgin from there as well. Many Indigenous children and adults speak Aboriginal English, which is a separate dialect of English, but only one state in Australia recognises that as a separate dialect of English, and that is Western Australia. So we're working across a very complex area linguistically and culturally, and realised very, very early on that we have to be so careful how we tread in terms of working with people who have been incredibly marginalised, whose culture has been marginalised, whose languages have been marginalised. And one of the biggest issues we come across is that for many people we're working with records of language that were documented by people that didn't care, documented by people who are not linguists, who just thought they were preserving a language before everyone died out. And we'll show you at the end two animations we've done. There are others, one from a woman who is still a speaker of her own language, and the other of a language that hasn't been spoken for over 100 years. But I just want to zero in on a little case study. I've worked with one particular community for the last 37 years, and it's in the Gulf of Carpentaria. So you've got the pointy end of Australia. If you come down into that dip, I work sort of on the coast in that dip up on the top of Australia, and I've been there working for the last 37 years. But just to give you an idea of rapid language loss. So this is a map of where I work, and the language I'm worked mostly with is Yanyua, which is where those group of islands are. So 37 years ago, there were over 200 speakers of that language. There are now 3. Wilangara, which is the next language to the west, the last speaker of that language died in 1901, and there is no recording of that language at all. We have no idea what it sounded like, looked like, or anything else. Mara, which is the next language on again, the last fluent speaker of that language died 2 years ago, but there are some people that remember bits and pieces of it. To the south of Yanyuwa, you have Binbinga. There is no speakers of that language left. Guranji, to the south again, there are a few speakers left. And Garawa, to the east, there's about 10 speakers left. Now, that's just a small snapshot of Australia. Very small portion of Australia. It gives you some idea of just what the colonial history has done in one area. And you're dealing still today with traumatized people. You know, the history of Australia, the European history of Australia is not as big as the States. It's only 226 years. So enormous things have happened very, very quickly. So this is a Google shot of where I work. You know, any of us can look at that map, any of us, anywhere in the world, and we could construct an image of what goes on there just by searching. We could work out what Senate seat belongs there, what House of Representatives seats belongs there, what townships are there, what industries are there. This is where one of the biggest lead, silver and zinc mines in the world can be found. So this is just an image of where it is. It's 1,000 kilometres from Darwin in the Northern Territory, 11-hour drive when you get off the plane. But the thing is that there is another history that is still existing here, and these are the clans that exist within these cultural groups. And these clans still exist, and they're very political. These are the politics of kinship. These are the politics that work in this country. And in other parts of Australia, it is similar. And so in each one of those coloured areas, you find your kin. You find your relatives. You find who you can get information from, how you get that information. So in terms of our work, this is the point at which we start negotiating. You know, we use this word community, but community really doesn't make any sense at all, because what we're really dealing with are families. Families who have very, very deep knowledge bases in the land, in the sea. So we really aren't working, we say we're working at a community level, but really what we're working with are families, and different kinds of families at any different time. So we have this idea of clans and country over land and sea, but we also have to get our heads around that not all ancestors are human. Like, human ancestors exist surely in each clan, but there are many non-human ancestors as well, which we have animated, which we have to understand. And this is only a very short example. Every living thing in this country, for example, would fit into one of those 4 clans. Every plant, every bird, every animal, every fish. And it's not a metaphor. We're dealing with this idea that these things are real kin, real family, just as much as human beings are real family. And for old people, this is the great fear, that young people are not going to remember these ideas of relationships to the earth and to the beings and the things that live in it. And it's one of the reasons that we do what we do. Now, I've spent many, many years working with old people. You know, as I said, 37 years ago, there were 260 speakers. There are now 3. And, you know, and one of the things I've done with many of these people is record language, record stories. And sure, we record with the last speakers, and then we write them down. But the issue is, as soon as we write them down, we have colonized them. Because these are oral traditions. These are traditions that have existed for millennia without anybody writing anything down, but keeping things in its head. And oral traditions work differently than a written tradition. You know, an oral tradition doesn't have full stops, capital letters, commas, pauses, question marks. That's all done by the way you use your voice. So while this, in one way, is great for building dictionaries and encyclopedias of language, it's also colonizing very, very quickly a language, and even more so once we translate it into English. And so I began to think, well, if we're doing this, what does it start to mean to the people that are telling these stories, who are fearful that the young people aren't learning, that they want to leave a record of their language, of their culture, of all the things that are important to them? And so I once asked this lady up in the top with the red t-shirt on what she thought about when she told this story. And she said, and she took out some photos from a photo album, and she said, these are all the things I thought of when I was telling you that story. I was thinking about my family, my grandfather, my father, the country where that story comes from, the ceremonies that belong to that story, the things that I can hunt when I go to that country, and the ancestors that are still in that country. These are all the things that I think of when I tell that story. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, how can we put all that back into a story? How can young people understand all that's in her mind? How do we get to a point? And of course, we come up with the whole issue of translation. Translation is so difficult. And this is the filter of translation, if you like. You know, in English, any one of us that speak English, if we talk about country, we immediately think of United States, of Australia, of China, of Germany. But in Indigenous Australia, it isn't like that at all. Country is actually a much different thing. Country is about kinship. Country is about that place that gives and receives life. Country can also be people. You can sing out to somebody and say, hey, you're my country. You're my kinsman, my kinswoman. And so we're entering this world, if we're going to animate, how do we even translate things? How do we begin to understand the process of what we're translating? Words like language don't mean English, Chinese, Japanese. Language in Indigenous Australia means this is how the old people spoke. This is the way that's not what they call in Australia a white fellow way. It's not the way that we will speak. It's our traditional language. Business isn't about financial dealings, isn't about Wall Street, isn't about capitalism or anything like this. It's about the law, it's about ceremonies. And so this is the filter of translation we work through. And then, of course, we begin to understand that Indigenous languages are incredibly complex in terms of just certain other kinds of knowledge. Now, this is a sea cow or a dugong. You know, the red word is the only word English has. This is not all the words Yanyuwa people have for dugong. This is just some of them. And when a language starts to die, it's this detail that goes first. It is this detail that disappears. You see it happen so quickly. And old people are saying, well, how do we bring this back? What do we do? And animation has allowed us to put some of that specificity back into the TV screen, back into a screen where children and old people sit together. We're not animating just for children. We're animating for that space where old people and young people sit together and they talk about what they're watching. So you might see old people sit with young people and watch the same thing 6 times and tell a different story every time they watch it. And we realize, of course, this old lady is now 85. She was 80 when this was taken, and she was in a land claim. And the judge was saying, tell me your name, tell me your Indigenous name, tell me where your country is, tell me who your ancestors were, tell me who your non-human ancestors were, how can you speak for your country, how do you know anything? And this woman just got up and danced. And she danced and some people sang for her. And then she sat down and she said, Your Honor, that's how I know. And so we're dealing not just with spoken words, we're dealing with the whole notion that knowledge is in the body, that the body can move and show knowledge as well. And again, this is where animation allows us to actually have people moving, showing knowledge, doing things, even if they're no longer there. And so part of my work over the years in this community is trying to work out ways to record this language visually, in writing. And so these were the beginning storyboards that I always had this idea that animation might work. And it wasn't until I met Brent here that these things started to take on life. Because we had to find a way that could reinforce a lot of just what I've been talking about. You know, Australia, probably like the United States, talks a lot about wilderness. The idea of wilderness is the wild place, and this might be a good example of wilderness. In Australia, we call this the outback, which really means that adventurous place, but the place where that don't know that country don't feel at home. And yet really it is home for a whole group of people. Maybe it's there in front. It's no longer the outback. And one of the big tasks I did with this community that has also helped to the animation project is we made an Indigenous atlas. And we put all the country names back where they belong because the Western maps had no names, because it was considered wilderness and therefore not named. And so we put all the names back that Indigenous people knew, all the different names that belong on that country. Because the most powerful colonial act is to strip bare all the names of the country or replace them with something else. But not only did we have to put all the names back, we had to put all the ancestral beings back in there too. All the non-human kin that brought that place meaning, that are still there in that place today. And so this has been a long journey that really began the process that Brent and Shannon are now involved with as well. But we also have to understand we're dealing with other forms of language. Not all language is speaking, language is singing, language is swearing, language is doing everything that we do. And when I went into this community, I used to draw lots of things. And one day an old man came up to me and he said, "Who do you want to kill?" And I said, "Nobody." He said, "Well, you're drawing. It must be you want to kill somebody." And I didn't understand it. And then he said, "Look, in our community, we don't draw. The only drawings we have are the marks on our bodies when we dance our ceremonies. But we don't draw. It's dangerous. Stop drawing." And I thought, well, what art exists apart from the body designs that people wear? And we find that song poetry in this community is very, very important. And so your mind is stretched then. How do we record song poems? And the first animation Brent will show later is a song poem. You know, because this is meant to be sung. It's not just meant to be written down. You know, that's that song. It's not words. There's a whole other history embedded in there about what that pigeon means, what the old man was trying to do when he composed that song. And so there's lots of these different kinds of songs in this community as well that, you know, just writing them down doesn't bring them to life at all. It's hunting a dugong. And so I spend a lot of time sitting with old people. And increasingly young people come around and sit with the old people and say, well, what's going on here? And here we're proofing ideas for an animation. Gathering around, talking about it, how they want things to look, what's the story that needs to be told. And then sometimes then with the script, sitting with the old last speakers, making sure we've got the script right, making sure that it is as accurate as it can possibly be. Now, that woman is one of the 3 last speakers of the language. Now, this language is very difficult because it's one of the only languages in the world that has male and female dialects. So men can't speak like women and women can't speak like men. There are no male speakers left. There are only women speakers left. So there's really big issues then about if we want to reinvigorate language in this community, what do they learn to speak? Because the women don't want the men to speak like women. And then when Brent does his magic, the kids gather around the draft computer on a veranda, watching, joining in, telling the stories over and over and over again. And I think the important point for us, for me and for all of us in this work is it's about a remembrance. And it's the living experience of the past that's represented through the stories that we animate. And they're really powerful histories, if we want to use that word, because they're local, they are orientated always towards the living, and because they sustain a relationship between the past and the present. The animations allow the past and present to come into one place, and neither consumes each other. So the animations that we do, the stories we tell, are open to retelling, rethinking, reworking. But the thing is, they're always political. And therefore, we have to take care in any reinterpretation of a story. None of these things are apolitical. They are always political, and we're always very aware of that. So that's sort of how we began in the community where I've been working. And then Brent came along after he saw the storyboards, and we got some money, and it's over to him as to what he does.
I'll just play one of the animations for you.
Which one are you going to show?
Buddy one.
Okay, this is an old lady who gave us a song to animate. She's only one of 10 speakers of this language. And she used to work on a cattle ranch, herding goats. That was her job. Her and her mum's job was to herd the goats for meat and for milk. And she composed this song many years ago with her mum about how beautiful she thought her goats were.
going to talk a little bit about how we get from what John was talking about to this final animation. This is the process kind of getting there from start to finish. So it looks like a bit of a scrambled mess because that's kind of a lot of these things we're doing all at the same time. But if you follow the little green arrows through, you get kind of from start to finish. So once a lot of the anthropological work has been done, what we're doing is we're starting with a story. The story is the most important thing. And because what we're also doing is a language preservation work, we need the story in kind of both English and in the Aboriginal language. So we kind of start off with this thing, it's probably a bit blurry from where you are, but this is broken up into paragraphs of, this is in Yanyuwa at the top and then English underneath. There's the two main ways we represent a story as in a traditional sense as like a campfire story where you have a narrator and they're telling the story kind of in the third person. The second way we do that is because a lot of the stories we do are origin creation stories, we like to portray those in the time of the event actually happening. So it's instead of going from a third person, we're going into a first person where the creation is happening around you as you're watching the animation. So that means taking the narration of someone just saying what's happening and turning that into a character-driven dialogue situation. So in this one we have, the osprey came from the west, he came a long way, he did this, and so and so. So that someone would just be saying that. In the second time, we've got all of that description stuff just happening as pure animation, and then the two characters, the dugong hunters and the osprey, interacting with each other, giving all of the exact same information as the narrator was doing, but just giving it through interactions. Once the script has been done, then we need to record, because all of the animation is done to the soundtrack. So we get all of the soundtrack done first, cut it up into its right timing, and then we know how long, if there's going to be people talking, how long they're going to be talking for, how long is the action happening. We kind of get a sense of, is it going to be a 2-minute animation or a 10-minute animation, that kind of thing. And because we're dealing a lot of the times with remote communities, we have little battery-operated microphones like this. We're just sitting around the campfire with two old ladies telling the story that they want animated, and we can do that remotely. Once we've recorded the story, we do a whole lot of storyboards. Some animations require hundreds of images. In the storyboards, we have the length of each shot, how the camera's going to be, what's happening in it, what the action is, which character's talking, what they're saying, and how long that's going to be. This process can take several months. It can take a matter of weeks. But after each one of these steps, we then we'd send them back to the community or the family, and they look through it and they make sure that everything that is essential of the story is in there. We haven't represented anything incorrectly. And this happens throughout the whole process of the animation. What's next is what's called an animatic. So we've got 3 different images here. The one to the left is the storyboards. The one to the bottom is what's called an animatic, and that's just a really rough, really rough version of what the final animation might look like. And then at the top we have the final, once it's completely finished. So once this again goes once it's finished, goes straight back to the community, and once they're happy with it, we can move on to the next stage, which is the animations are kind of generally broken down into the three main parts, which is you've got the stage, which is the landscape. In this case, a lot of the time the landscape is real places which we have to visit and take lots of photos. Secondly is the characters, the cast, and a lot of the time those casts are animals which interact. A lot of the time they're also people. And then the third and most important is the lesson, which is the story in itself. So when it comes to character designs and the animals, we consult Google, generally is the best source of reference these days for anything biological. So this one is the hawksbill turtle. We can get hundreds and hundreds of different images of what the hawksbill turtle looks like. We then do some sketches, kind of characterize the turtle a little bit, give it some more expressive eyes, facial features. In this case, the turtle needed to talk, so we had to give it some expressive lips. So this is generally done like this, just with a few sketches. Landscapes, we do a lot of traveling because these are in specific locations, so we need to get out there and take heaps of photos, get a really good sense of what the landscape's like, and we like to spend a few days out there so we can see morning, midday, sunsets, nighttime, get all of the colours and the feel for that right. And a lot of the time, because the origin stories are about a journey of one of the main characters, and it's usually related to the country. So this is the journey of the sea turtle and the osprey, and we have at the top the list of the characters, and then represented with the lines, you've got the journey that they're going on. In this instance, it's almost 100, or let's say a 60-mile journey of osprey chasing turtles across many, many, many different very important places. So this is all in the pre-production stage. Sometimes we are dealing with or animating stories that aren't so country specific. These are a few examples of some from Western Australia where they're more lesson anecdotal. And this particular community also had some children's books that they had illustrated, and they wanted those books animated, but they wanted to use the artwork from those books that the community had done themselves. So this is some examples of, on the left you have the artwork from the community that they wanted, that was from the books, and then on the right we used all of that artwork in the production of the animations to keep them within the same kind of thematic and feel. And this is another one as well. So the book's on the left and the final animations on the right. How we begin constructing these things, this is in a program called Maya. Maya is software that is used in the film industry and the animation industry, from everything from Pixar films to The Lord of the Rings or Avatar. So everyone, it's a really high-end software. There are other softwares out there which I can talk about later if you have any questions about that. But 3D animation is different to 2D animation, which is just a hand-drawn kind of flat image. 3D animation is more like digital puppetry. So what we have initially, it's kind of like modeling with clay. You start off with a ball of clay, and then you kind of stretch out certain bits, so we can stretch out the head, and then we stretch out the flippers, and then from there you give it a bit more detail like that. And then we paint it, just like, so you kind of like have to, it's kind of like skinning an animal, you have to flatten it out. You've got a 3D model, and then you kind of flatten it out, and then you can paint it just as if it's a sheet of paper. You give it all of the colours and textures and all that kind of thing. And then when it's done, you end up with a turtle, like that. But then we have to make that turtle move. So inside the turtle, well, this is with a bird, but you have what you would find underneath or inside a real living thing. You have a whole system of bones and muscles and joints and all these things. So that you can articulate your character. And this is where I mean, like, it's kind of like digital puppetry. So on the left, you can see there's all these little lines and little circles. They're like the puppet strings. So you pull one of those blue balls out and the wings, the feathers will move in whatever direction you want them to. And then once that's all finished, we end up with kind of the final look of the character. Landscapes are the same. We have to make everything from scratch. So every tree, every rock, all of the sky, the clouds, water. This is in its kind of raw form in the computer, and then what it looks like when it's finished. These are some rocks and some atmospherics, and with a man for scale. So when we go out into the landscape with the community, we take as many photos as we can. So all of the rocks, we take photos of the rocks and we use those photos to make the animation look the same. So this is, on the left, we have some of the reference photos from the community, and then we have the finished product of the scene from where the goats and the old lady were walking. So this helps us, all these processes help us get the truest representation of where we are and what we are trying to represent. The next and the most fun part is actually animating, and especially my favorite part is making characters talk, especially when they're turtles or birds or fish and things that don't normally talk. But here's just an example of the puppet strings that I was talking about. So each of the little dots on this character control a certain part of the facial expression. So you have quite a few around the lips and the eyes, and a bit more around the eyebrows and things. And every time you move them, it's kind of like someone's grabbing your face and moving it up and down. We can throw in the audio of the recording of the dialogue.
Minjanda gulinj baba duru yuwang murupta bababran mijan gubi bago dur. Minjanda gulinj baba duru yuwang murupta bababran mijan gubi bago dur.
This is just another example of some more character animation. We have two emu hunters carrying their kill back to the camp with just kind of the inside of their body and how we animate them, and then what it looks like when it's finished. There's a whole lot of stuff happening under their skin. And the same again with the old lady with her goats. So you can see all the kind of the lines under each of them there, the bones, and then there's the kind of the puppet strings that help them move. And then the final finished animation. Every now and then there'll be something that happens in a story that we have to add some kind of special effects. In this particular example, we have a pigeon that's putting the spell on the moon because there's a bit of jealousy happening. The moon has all these powers that the pigeon doesn't, and the pigeon doesn't really like it. Oop. So you kind of have to simulate a whole bunch of, we would have some sparkles and there's some smoke and some fog, and this is just different stages of the development of this particular special effect, and this is what it looked like in the final. Rendering is, so this is kind of how we work in the 3D animation software. There's a whole lot of lines, it's really messy, and it's really kind of, a lot of the time it's hard to really see what's going on. But obviously we don't want the animation to look like that. So as you've seen through some of the other slides, there's a process of getting from this to this, and then eventually to that. So this is how we want the animation to look. And so rendering is the process of getting from that raw wireframe data into something that looks pretty and will be appealing to, well, hopefully everyone. And then there's a few more final things that we need to kind of just help the animation be completed, so like some color corrections and some camera effects. So this is how a rendered frame comes out of the animation software. We add certain filters like depth of field, so everything that's white is blurred and everything that's black is in focus, and then we overlay that to the top, do some color corrections, and we get to the final, the theme of it, which this I think gives you much more of an idea that it's at sunset, they're sitting around the fire. It's got that kind of purple orangey light to it, whereas in this one is a bit green and not so right. Here's another example of the moon when it first came out of the rendering from the animation. In the top right, you can't even see any of the facial features. So we had to do another render of highlighting all of those creases, and then we add some glow to it, and then we end up on the left with the final animation. Once everything's been rendered, because of the process at the beginning of the animation pipeline with the storyboards and the animatic and recording, we already have that kind of timeline, so we already know how long it's going to be and how all the editing is going to work, so we can just slot the rendered versions into the timeline, replace the rough versions, and usually it's pretty good. Finally, we do a lot of sound effects just to kind of accompany the image. We generally work in 3 different layers. You have the dialogue, which is the most important. Underneath that is kind of all of the interaction sound effects, if there's splashes, if there's footsteps, all that kind of thing. And then underneath is atmospherics, which we usually record on location, like trees and wind and running water, anything like that. And that's the process.
My name's Shannon Faulkhead. I'm what they call the Finkel Fellow. Just in case you don't know, the Monash Country Lines Archive is a program at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, Victoria. As John was telling you, he started working with the Yanyuwa people 37 years ago. And from that, he and Brent had done a number of animations for that community. In 2011, we received funding from a philanthropic group who funded us for 5 years to do animations across Australia. So we started opening up to other parts of the country, pretty much to anyone who wanted to come forward. One of the things about this program, well, there's a few points, but I'll go through them. One is that when we started the program, we said Monash can't own the animations. Just because we're animating someone's story doesn't mean that we take ownership of it. So we've got an agreement where we sign over copyright to the community, even though Brent didn't show the end slides of the animations. All of them have the copyright as per the group that we're working with. So they tell us what they want the copyright to be. So if a community comes to us, we tend not to go out and say, hey, you should do this, is really good for you. It's more a case if it works for a community, they contact us, we'll go out and speak to them, or we might have a conversation on the phone, depends on how they want to operate. We explain that what we do, we have an animator. We can assist with the storyboard, we can assist with scripting, and we can also work in partnership to do the actual animation. What the community needs to do before we can even start to animate is to decide what animations, what language they want to use, because some of them might have a number of different dialects, which story they're going to have, because there's a number of communities that will have a number of different clans, so they might have different versions depending on where they are on country. So with the Yanyuwa, for example, they decided that each clan would have their own animation. So they decided which story, who would have what story, and then they would animate that one. And those decisions have to be made within the community. That's something that we can't decide. So we've had groups that have contacted us when we first started in 2011, and then last year we'll ring up and go, oh, by the way, we're ready to animate now. because they've gone through that process, they've gone and talked to others, that have made the decision that this is something that they want to do, this is something that they find important. When we say that it's a language preservation and an archive, it is, but it's not necessarily in the same way that most people think of it as an archive. For many people, they look at the animation and go, that's an archive. It's got story, it's got language, it's got, within the credits, it's got all this information about who the stories belong to, who the families are, all that information. However, for us, they're an archive in the sense that they're for intergenerational communication. They are not the end product. The end product is the discussion and the stories that are shared after the animations. I steal one of John's stories all the time, but he apparently forgives me. A couple of times, one of the times that when he went up to Yanyuwa to take some of the animations up there, one of the women came out of the house and they go, you and your, said a very bad word, say bloody animations, and he goes, oh no, I'm in trouble, what do I do now? And she goes, I was up till 2 o'clock with the young ones until they finally got to sleep. Then I was up till 4 o'clock with the older ones, going through the animations. I was remembering things that I didn't even know that I knew, or that I'd forgotten that I'd known. So, because the kids, through the animations, she would start talking and then the kids would ask her more questions and they were learning stuff. So, and one of the other stories from that community, because Daniel have been sitting with these animations for about 5 years now, whilst the other communities, it might be only 6 to 12 months. So we don't know how each community is going to react, but for the Yanyuwa, he goes up there and kids can recite whole animations, or if they go out in the country, they know it from the animations. Because that's one of the things I think, don't know if John made clear, was they were the group that decided on 3D animation, because they took every form of animation up there. They said, no, we want it to look real. And as soon as they saw the 3D, they said, that's what we want. We want our country to look real. We want our animals to look real. We want our people to look real. And the beauty with 3D animation was that Brent can actually recreate country that no longer exists. So with a lot of the Victorian communities that we're working with, he can put mountains back into countryside that have been cleared for farmlands. He's able to put stones back that aren't there anymore. Rock formations, stones. Areas that are flooded or have been drained can have water put back or taken away. So they can actually see the country as their stories tell. But it also is, at the same time, they can then take the next generations and show them and say, remember that part in that story? That's that there. That's what it looks like now. And they can tell the story of how it ended up being that way. So that's one of the reasons that we use this form of animation. It is, as Brent has illustrated, it's not an easy program to work with. We do have one young Tangarong fella who is learning 3D animation, mainly for gaming, but he's interested in it. We're hoping others will. It's a university degree at Monash, but we've done a couple of test training with with one of the communities that they really wanted their young ones trained. So we went out there, but they were people that had graphic design experience beforehand, so they had some knowledge. And when I say young ones, I'm not necessarily talking about little tackers about this age. We're talking about from 5 or 6 through to 50 and 60-year-olds. So a lot of the people that we're working with, whilst we call them communities, some of them are the last speakers of their language. So at the moment we're working with 2 groups in Victoria, Tangarong and Gunditjmara, Ghana in South Australia, Yaro in Broome in Western Australia, Gawa, Garawa and Yanyuwa in Northern Territory and Nyampa in New South Wales. So it's a lot of community, it sounds like a lot, but each one are in different stages. As I was saying before, I'll use the animation, the Tangarong animation. They were one of the first community groups to contact us in 2011. We only finished that animation about 2 months ago. That wasn't because Brent wasn't able to make the animation. All they had in regards to their language was a word book, a language book that had been done a couple of years before. So most of our meetings through that period, because they asked us to be involved in it, because there were people that we knew. I am Aboriginal from Victoria, so I've worked in cultural heritage and archives in Victoria most of my life, so I know a lot of the people from there. And was working with a linguist to actually translate their stories back into Tangarong. And I don't just mean the language, but actually the story. So they wanted to put back knowledge that they had from their families back into those stories, as well as what they had written down. So it took up until, I think it was the end of last year, when we were finally able to record the soundtrack. And as Brent indicated, he can't start animating until he's got the soundtrack. With this, as I said, we don't own the animations. Even if we, as part of our agreement, as I said, we have a memorandum of agreement, and each one is individualised to each community depending on what they want. And with that, we can't even put the animation, we can't show the animations or put them on our website until they're ready or until they give permission. So with the Tangarong, it's still going, they've given permission for us to show it here. However, they aren't ready for it to be on the web. So it's not publicly available yet. But every group that we talk to, they say that they want everyone to see them at some stage, but they want to go through their own processes first within the community. So they want to share it with their family and maybe learn a bit more about the language. Thank you.